It's been a long way to the top for humanity. We were once a bunch of hairless apes running across the Great African Rift, running away from giant cats trying to hunt us and turn us into their own form of kibble. But now we are indisputably the dominant species, and we even have some vehicles flying around in the sky. However, we could have not gone to this point without the help of some of our best friends, and best food for that matter. This video will be covering the most important animals that helped us create the human civilization we live in today. Let's start off with Canis lupus familiaris, which is also known as the dog. Dogs, as we know, are man's best friend, and they're the first animal to ever be domesticated, done in the Mesolithic phase. This predates civilization, and it was before we had agriculture, so it makes sense that our bond with dogs would be stronger than virtually any other animal. Now, it is obvious that Pomeranians, for example, did not exist in the real world, and I don't think they would last more than 2 hours in the wilderness. But it just so happened to be that humans interacted with another predator that predates the Pomeranian, the Pleistocene wolf, which in many ways is most similar to the Eurasian gray wolf. Granted, the domestication of the dog was not a simple process, but rather a dual process, or perhaps a triple process, as there were multiple domestications of the dog in Europe, East Asia, and the Americas over very long periods of time, and very large swaths of geography even within those categories. These wolves had family structures that were quite similar to that of early man. On top of that, humans and wolves are both pack hunters. Eventually, some wolves were more likely to be lone wolves, and thereby would interact with human encampments looking for scraps of food, and some would eventually befriend humans. The wolves that were aggressive would eventually be killed, whereas the friendlier wolves would breed, and over the course of several generations with human supervision, become dogs. Another theory is that humans may have actually clashed with wolves and would occasionally kill the adults, but would take up the pups as their own given how cute they are. Pups have some of the same body to face and face to eye proportions as human infants, so it makes sense that early man, and early woman for that matter, would find them to be very cute. With the dexterity and intellect of a bipedal ape and the sense of smell and bite force of a wolf, the two became a dynamic duo, arguably outcompeting the Neanderthals, which did not have dogs. As many humans adopted agriculture during the Neolithic era, dogs took on a variety of new tasks. For example, some became shepherds, herding goats and sheep. But those were for the nomads. In settled communities, you'd oftentimes see dogs engaging in jobs like guarding. In fact, the agricultural revolution has made an impact on the physiology of dogs. For example, wolves cannot process starches, but dogs can. This is because dogs have lived alongside humans over the course of thousands of years, and oftentimes had to eat some of the grain that humans produced. Over the course of time, the wolf/dogs that could eat this grain would eventually become more able to survive and adapt and spread their genes. And as a result today, dogs can eat kibble. Dry dog food, after all, usually has some sort of corn or wheat products in it. It's not just meat. And plus, wet dog food is disgusting. I never want to touch one of those things. I made an entire history about how dogs impacted human culture, so if you want a more in-depth look, you could check it out. But overall, I find it quite amusing that this species was essential for everything from hunting to guarding to sledding to solving crimes to even escorting carriages and taking care of barns. But today, they've pretty much just been reduced to cute, useless friends that don't really contribute to society but are fun to hang around. So let's move on to the next major animal on the list. Cattle. Now, cattle were most likely domesticated from the now extinct aurochs. I honestly don't really know how to pronounce it. I've heard multiple pronunciations of the same word. Anyway, this was kind of like a big cow if you think about it, not your typical bovine you see today. These species show very clear sexual dimorphism between what we call cows, the females, and what we call bulls, the males. The sexual dimorphism is so apparent that there is no widely used term in the English language for the singular to refer to a member of the cow species. We just say cow or bull. almost as though they're two different animals. Anyway, the domestication of cattle was not a single process, but rather a series of processes over a long period of time, as interactions with the aurochs and other bovines eventually led to the creation of what we now know as bulls and cows, or just cattle. However, there are several varieties of cattle. You may have noticed different physical appearances of the Taurine cattle that you're familiar with in the West, as opposed to the Zebu cattle that they have in India. Namely, the fact that the Western cattle, by and large, are really, really fat. At this point in the history of agriculture, different breeds of cattle were bred to produce different products. The cows that you eat are very different than the cows that we get milk from, at least in most cases. I wonder what these steroidal Belgian blues taste like. Now, one country that would clearly never produce a Belgian blue en masse today is India. After all, India has a majority Hindu population, and in Hinduism, cows are considered sacred. In large swaths of Indian culture, cows have become symbols of fertility, motherhood, and benevolence. However, this can get ugly. For example, there are groups of Hindu nationalists called the Beef Brigades that go out on vengeful attacks against Muslim minority populations in defense of these innocent cows. Moving on to more important subjects than cow avengers, cattle are one of the biggest contributors to climate change because they tend to burp and fart a lot. After all, these animals have 4 stomachs, or more accurately, one stomach broken down into 4 massive compartments, and this makes them easily able to digest cellulose and grass, something our digestive systems can't do. However, in more recent years with industrialization of agriculture, many of these cattle are living off of a diet of corn, something they're not typically used to, and as a result of this, a lot of them burp like crazy, which produces an insane amount of methane. Some people look at these figures and want to promote more of a vegetarian or vegan diet to cut greenhouse gases. Now, cattle were predominantly popular among settled communities that already stuck in one place due to farming crops. However, another group of humans would prefer a more nomadic lifestyle of herding goats and sheep. I'm gonna put goats and sheep into the same category, even though they're technically different animals. Nonetheless, they still have a similar impact on human history. And the two are just kind of impossible to unwind in that sense. Goats and sheep are grazing animals, and in most cases, grazing animals are very stupid. They don't need to be smart because, after all they do is eat grass and other types of plants, and they don't need to learn how to hunt or any other skill for that matter other than chewing and regurgitating grass and then shitting it out. And sleeping, I guess. So at the end of the day, they're really easy to lead, more than virtually any other species, at least as far as sheep are concerned. Humans came across wild sheep in the form of the mouflon, native to the Caspian Mountains. These sheep had far larger horns, and the horns were also pointier, and probably were not as easy to herd as the sheep we have today. On top of that, they didn't produce as much food as our contemporary sheep do. Nonetheless, through the power of domestication, humans bred for selective traits so that they would become friendlier and have smaller horns and by and large just be more docile. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention they'd produce a lot more meat and milk and wool. To this day, sheep are pretty much synonymous with docile idiots, and we really like them being docile idiots. This positive reputation of passivity and peacefulness has led to a lot of herding societies developing a sort of appreciation for the sheep, and this can be most well known in Judaism and Christianity, where lambs are oftentimes viewed as a symbol of Jesus, or perhaps a symbol of Christianity. In Judaism, they play a role in many prominent Bible stories from Cain and Abel and many others. A reputation that is rather different than another herding animal, namely the goat. Goats trace their origins to the Caucasus Mountains as well, and in an area composed of what is now Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. The wild counterpart was a species of ibex, which is kind of like a mountain goat if you think about it. These animals eventually became domesticated and used for milk and meat. However, still to this day, they tend to be a lot more rowdy than their sheep counterparts. This led to a reputation of being associated with rebellion, and in some cases, evil. There's a reason why the depiction of the devil has goat-like features on his head with horns and sometimes even hooves. The satyrs in Greek mythology were basically horny, perverted goatmen. In modern, urban Western societies, goats have kind of fallen out of favor. And by and large, the only interaction you'll have with goat products is goat cheese, which by and large is known for being more acidic and sour tasting. Nonetheless, goat agriculture is still very popular in places like the Middle East and the Caribbean, and to a lesser extent sub-Saharan Africa. Goats also play an important environmental role as they tend to eat shrubs and prefer higher elevation than sheep do. However, this can lead to concerns over erosion in certain hilly areas, as they oftentimes overgraze the roots and shrubs. Now let's move on to the next animal on our list. Pigs. You might be surprised to learn that pigs were domesticated in the part of the world that almost never eats pork today, that region being the Fertile Crescent in what is now Iraq and Syria in the Middle East. The Abrahamic religions did not exist at the time to tell people to not eat bacon, and as a result, pork was eaten freely. Namely from a wild type of boar that lived across much of the basin of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In sharp contrast to most other animals we eat, pigs are actually very smart, and they're pretty damn strong too. Due to their high intelligence and strength, they were rather difficult to domesticate in comparison to, say, sheep. They could escape their pens, and when they were in the wild, they could easily breed with wild boars and repopulate the areas around them. This allowed them to proliferate in vast areas of not only the Middle East, but also Europe and East Asia, the two regions of the world where pigs are most popular as a form of food. Despite their impressive ability to turn almost anything that humans would never eat into energy required to produce meat that we eventually do want to eat, pigs didn't become popular everywhere. Eventually, Abrahamic religions began to form, first emerging around Judea, and this started a reign of pork taboos. We can oftentimes tell the beginnings of Jewish civilization by looking at the areas where we see less remains of pigs, which exist in the archaeological record in what is now Israel and the Palestinian territories. But for some reason, around a certain period of time during the Iron Age, just kind of stopped. Now, Christianity is a religion that started off as an offshoot of Judaism, but it eventually abandoned the opposition to pork because by and large, St. Paul was trying to appeal to many non-Jewish people. Islam, on the other hand, another Abrahamic religion, does forbid pork, like Judaism, and today Muslim-majority countries have the lowest rates of pork consumption around the world. Even Muslims who drink alcohol and gamble will oftentimes abstain from pork. In Hinduism, there isn't any explicit prohibition from pork as far as most mainstream Hindu sects are concerned. However, by and large, they're not particularly popular as a form of food in the Indian subcontinent, including in Hindu regions. This may be because they by and large are seen as dirty. Nonetheless, pork consumption is very high in other parts of the world, namely the Americas. The Spanish found pigs to be very helpful because they were hardy and could breed easily. After all, they're piggish when it comes to sex as well. So they ended up proliferating across much of the Americas, where they became an invasive species. This has led them to becoming a very popular source of food in many Latin American cuisines. However, these wild boars have also wreaked havoc on native populations of animals and plants. Today, they're also one of the worst feral species in the southern United States. Let's move on to chickens. Unlike most of the other animals I named, these don't come from the Middle East originally, but rather Southeast Asia. They don't come from grasslands as they're not herding animals. They're birds after all, and they're native to the jungles of Southeast Asia. This species is known as the red jungle fowl, although it's worth pointing out that many of their genes are mixed with that of the gray jungle fowl. Anyway, this species creates ridiculous amounts of eggs whenever the bamboo seeds in the rainforest are dispersed for food. So humans figured out, hey, why don't we just feed them a ton of food and they'll produce a ton of eggs? And so they'll get fatter and we'll get more eggs and meat. We feed them and they feed us. It's a win-win situation, except for when the chickens get killed because we eat them. Anyway, unlike pigs, chickens are pretty stupid and they're quite easily manipulated. And they weren't big or dangerous, so the process of domesticating them was probably a lot easier. For this reason, among various others, chickens are found in nearly every culture around the world. They are by far the most popular form of meat as far as birds are concerned, far more so than ducks, geese, quails, and others. They're also more popular than red meat in most other cultures, mainly because chickens are cheaper and easier to take care of, and they produce a great deal of meat in proportion to the amount of energy you put in. They're a more productive protein source, and they don't fart out methane like cows. In some countries like the United States, where red meat was typically more popular, chicken has now outpaced beef as the most popular form of protein. But this isn't just in the United States, it's all over the world, particularly in East Asia, where chicken meat is by and large the most popular form of meat in many of these countries, oftentimes outbeating pork. This is part of the reason why American fast food chains like KFC and Popeyes that serve fried chicken have become so much more common than, say, Burger King in East Asia. Now, let's take a break from animals we eat to one that we ride, or more accurately, used to ride. The horse. Horses are native to North America. Well, sort of. They were much smaller back then, and a different species. But they would eventually ditch much of the Americas to travel across the land bridge to Siberia and eventually to the Central Asian steppes, evolving into multiple different species along the way. They are eventually domesticated by humans, albeit far later than the dog or even the goat were domesticated. As a result of this, a people group we now call the Proto-Indo-Europeans domesticated this horse and spread rapidly, taking over almost all of Europe, parts of the Middle East, namely Iran, and much of the Indian subcontinent. The horse, along with the invention of the wheel, is what allowed these Proto-Indo-European peoples to move in different locations around much of the Eurasian landmass. This is the reason why several languages you now know, like Portuguese to Russian to Farsi in Iran to Hindi in India, are all Indo-European languages. Horses would become domesticated primarily for transportation and military purposes, as horse meat, generally speaking, tends to be a bit taboo in many cultures, as humans have grown a great deal of attachment to these brethren. Generally speaking, unless you live in France or another francophone country, you're unlikely to see horse meat at the grocery store. This habit of eating horse meat in France probably arose from famines in military garrisons, but that's a subject for another story. Another group of people that sometimes eat horses are nomadic communities who had to rely on them in times of desperation. But nonetheless, these nomadic people groups still revered the horse for helping them herd goats and sheep. There were numerous equestrian cultures throughout history: the Scythians, the Huns, the Turks, and most famously the Mongols. These people groups proved to be very notorious for their incredible military conquests done under a short period of time. They swept across the plains and into river valleys, burning cities to the ground and subjugating settled peoples. However, the city dwellers would win at the end of the day. With the invention of gunpowder and more advanced weaponry, the nomadic cavalry became far less formidable. Eventually, settled societies like Russia and China would take over much of the Eurasian steppe, and the conquerors became the conquered. In the Americas, Europeans, first starting with the Spanish, would introduce the horse. Native Americans would take up some of these horses and domesticate them themselves. This would form a new equestrian culture. This was particularly apt for hunting bison across the Great Plains of what are now the United States. And of course, these equestrian peoples would eventually become conquered by settled peoples. In other words, the very European settlers who brought the horses in the first place. Another major change in human history was brewing: the Industrial Revolution, which would bring about steam power, trains, and eventually automobiles, and other mechanical forms of transportation that are far stronger than horses, faster than horses, and don't shit. Although they do produce a lot of gas, which we're currently dealing with the problems with. Nonetheless, these horses are still seen as symbols of power and speed, and today they are by and large bought and sold and used for sporting purposes or for companionship. And they're also seen as status symbols, similar to that of sports cars. After all, Ferrari's symbol is a horse. Let's move on to the internet's favorite animal, the cat. Cats are the only animals to domesticate themselves, and unlike dogs that predate civilization, cats were actually domesticated during the agricultural revolution. Or should I say, they domesticated themselves during the agricultural revolution. The rise of human farms and human settlements led to the rise of a lot of pests like mice, rats, and cockroaches. And now, cats like to murder all of these things, which we greatly appreciate. And while we don't particularly take a liking to cat's milk or cat meat, and we can't produce any cat cheese from the cat milk, we can use cats to basically massacre any other animal that is small that we don't like. And this led many early agrarian societies to have a deep-seated sense of respect for cats, namely the ancient Egyptians, who even depicted some of their goddesses with the heads of cats. Cats have also been associated with the divine feminine. I mentioned goddesses after all. There's a sort of feminine mystique with the way that they looked and act, and cat ownership is oftentimes associated with women. This may be due to the fact that cats are roughly the same size as a human infant and have certain body and facial proportions that are similar to that of a child. After all, there's a reason why we find them so cute, and to some women they can even be a substitute for a husband or child, as controversial as it may be. You know what cats like to eat? The next animal or group of animals on this list, fish. I've been a little bit too mammal-centric. The only non-mammal I've talked about so far are chickens, so I'm going to move on to fish. Now, I fully acknowledge the term fish is not a species. It's really just a nebulous category that isn't exactly scientific either, but is worth discussing because we're already familiar with it. Some sort of an aquatic animal with a vertebrate and gills. Yes, I'm fully aware that there are lungfish, fish that have lungs obviously, and there are mud skippers that can walk on land. But by and large, when I say the word fish, you all know what I'm talking about. The category of fish is a universe unto itself that includes marine fish and freshwater fish and even some brackish fish in the mangroves. It includes cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays, the aforementioned lungfish, which are our ancestors, and the one that we're most familiar with, or the ones we're most familiar with, bony fish, which are the vast majority of fish on the planet and the vast majority of the fish we interact with. Mostly living in A, freshwater river systems, or B, marine systems off the coast. Again, I fully acknowledge that this category of food ranges from everything from freshwater perch to yellowfin tuna, but nonetheless, fish are renowned for their nutritional value, namely what we know today as omega fatty acids. And they are considered one of the healthiest sources of protein, fat, and micronutrients you can eat. On top of that, you don't need to farm them. Yes, there's aquaculture today, but throughout the vast majority of human history, and even today, most fishermen fished what they got from the open ocean. And as long as they didn't overfish, the stocks will rebound. This led to humans gravitating towards bodies of water. Now, this is obviously the case for freshwater since you can drink and use it for irrigation, but you started to see more and more communities pop around coastal areas, along seas and oceans. Water bodies we can't readily drink from because, after all, they have way too much salt. Unfortunately today, we have overfished. Many fish stocks, like cod among others, have not been able to rebound to previous levels. This has resulted in a whole body of international law surrounding fisheries and exclusive economic zones. Now, you know what other animal humans interacted with, especially when they were close to still bodies of fresh water? A certain type of invertebrate. Now, every animal I've discussed so far at least has a backbone. So it's about time that I include ones that don't have backbones, but have exoskeletons. Arthropods, or more specifically insects, are quite possibly the most successful group of animals on the planet, arguably more successful than humans by many metrics. However, there are two in particular that have had a colossal impact on human civilization, one overwhelmingly bad and the other overwhelmingly positive. Let's start off with the bad because I'm a pessimist and a cynical asshole. Mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are our greatest predators. No, not the tigers, not the bears, not the crocodiles, but rather these little thingies that congregate around freshwater bodies. Mosquitoes love still fresh water. That's where they lay their eggs, or more accurately, their larvae. This leads to still freshwater bodies becoming cesspools of mosquito infestation. You know what other species really likes freshwater bodies? Humans. It just so happens to be that Mosquitoes are outstanding transmitters for a variety of diseases, such as malaria, dengue fever, and yellow fever. For this reason, many humans prefer to settle near rivers rather than swamps, even though both had fresh water. After all, running water is not as good for mosquitoes. The development of cities near swamps and other forms of wetlands gained a reputation due to their association with mosquitoes, even if ancient peoples had no idea what was actually causing the disease. There are even episodes of history whereby mosquitoes played a pivotal role in determining which side won a war, without really caring about it. For example, during the Punic Wars of Rome versus Carthage, there was an instance in which the general Hannibal of Carthage invaded the Italian peninsula, but many of his men eventually got sick near the marshes around Rome. This decimated their military at a time when manpower was most needed, and it is part of the reason why Rome survived. The issue with mosquitoes continued, far further than that. For example, the southern United States was once a malaria hellhole before much of the swamps were drained, or at the very least carefully managed by conservation efforts. Today, malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses tend to be associated with the tropics. Not just because many of these countries are humid and warm, which is perfect for mosquitoes, but also because many of these countries have poor healthcare infrastructures. So, mosquitoes are pretty much the most evil creatures to come across that we know of. After all, they feed off of the blood of the poor, even though they don't really mean it. Worse than cockroaches. Now, let's move to an animal that doesn't suck, both literally and figuratively. The noble bee. Now, technically, animals are not good or evil, they're just doing what their instincts tell them to do. But for the sake of not making all insects sound terrible, I gotta talk about bees. Einstein acknowledged that without bees, human civilization would collapse. After all, our agricultural system is reliant on bees. You know, the agricultural system we rely on not to starve. It turns out that bees play an essential role for 8 billion people on the planet who could not feed themselves. Without bees, it's likely that we would not be able to pollinate much of our crops. And yes, it is true that there are other pollinators like hummingbirds, butterflies, bats, geckos, etc. that are also important, but bees by and large are the most critical player. However, bees face significant threats, namely their dwindling size and the number of beehives. This may be due to a type of fungus or a type of bacteria, or to climate change, due to greenhouse gases or habitat destruction, etc. Some people blame pesticides, perhaps insecticides. The truth is that the jury is still out on what is causing this reduction in bee populations overall. My main message is that these guys are so much more important than producing honey, and after all, it is just a handful of species that produce that honey. The rest of them still play a critical role in pollination. Now, I've talked about a lot of animals over the course of this video, and the last message I want to give, if I want to jump on a pedestal, is that we're a very technologically advanced society today. However, we've been largely disconnected from nature. It's worth pointing out just how reliant we are on some creatures we share the planet with, even in spite of all of our technology. And yes, I'm fully aware that this sounds like some hippy-dippy bullshit, but putting that aside, it's important to note that even though we've produced our own magnificent artificial worlds, we are still deeply rooted in the natural world. Many of these creatures deserve a lot more recognition than they get. Except for mosquitoes. Fuck them.